Hey guys, it's Kwani here. I decided to enter an online tournament to test out my Fury movesets for our best horse rider, none other than calyrex Shadow. With 72 players registered and submitted their team sheets, I'm entering with a team that supports this calyrex to victory. As you can see, we have Terra Fighting Terra Blast calyrex to deal with pesky dark and normal types Pokemon. You can also take advantage of its Terra typing defensively, resisting dark type moves. There's also a really cool interaction where in open team sheet environment where you know your opponent will use Snarl, you can Terra Fighting and use Nasty Plot, leaving you at +1 after Snarl, which is still a decent boost, plus resisting the typing, taking less damage. Amoonguss for redirection, Spore Pressure for Trick Room users, and Clear Smog for boost up strategies. We also have a bulky Incineroar with Will-O-Wisp to shut down hyper offense teams, Mienshao as a wide guard and fake out user, Tornadus with Taunt to shut down Amoonguss and to interrupt the opposing boost up strategy, Scary Phase to win Tailwind showdowns and can be used under Trick Room to change speed tiers. And last but not the least, we have a super bulky Kingambit with Assault Vest, mainly good for mirror opposing calyrex Shadow teams and Lunala teams. Post editing this video, I found a really cool interaction with calyrex and Kingambit. If you open with calyrex Shadow and you know the opponent will use Electro Web or Snarl, you have the option to switch out calyrex for Kingambit, which triggers its ability Defiant. If you like this video, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel for more VGC content. If you want to try out this team, rental code is in the description down below. With that said, let's get on to the video. My opponent's team is using a calyrex Shadow team with Tornadus, Wellspring Ogerpon, Assault Vest Raging Bolt, Incineroar with Safety Goggles, and Rocky Helmet Amoonguss, with calyrex holding the Life Orb item and Terra Fairy. My opponent led with Tornadus and Raging Bolt, and I chose to lead with calyrex Shadow and Tornadus. I decided to Terra calyrex Shadow straight away plus Nasty Plot as I was predicting the opposing Raging Bolt to use Snarl. This allows me to go +2 on special attack, then -1 after the Snarl, but also resisting the dark type move with Terra Fighting. The opposing Tornadus sets up Tailwind and I went for a Nasty Plot. As I predicted it, the opposing Raging Bolt used Snarl, leaving me at +1 special attack. I went for Bleak Wind with Tornadus, trying to break the opposing Tornadus Focus Sash, but I missed. So I decided to protect with calyrex so my Tornadus can have another go at breaking the Focus Sash before calyrex can go for Astral Barrage. The opposing Tornadus went for Bleak Wind and missed my Tornadus. Then it's my turn to go Bleak Wind and I missed again. Raging Bolt used Electro Web and did a decent amount of damage to my Tornadus. I finally went for Tailwind and Astral Barrage, hoping it would at least knock out Raging Bolt so calyrex survives for another turn, but it wasn't enough, as the opposing Tornadus lands a Bleak Wind, knocking out my Tornadus and leaving calyrex at 20% health, allowing Raging Bolt to pick up a knockout. It's 2 against 4. My chances of winning is looking grim as I stare down to my final 2 Pokemon, Amoonguss and Kingambit. The opposing Tornadus went for Protect and I decided to go for Sucker Punch on Tornadus to try and protect my Amoonguss. Raging Bolt used Dragon Pulse on my Kingambit, which didn't do a lot of damage. Amoonguss landed a Spore on Raging Bolt, which was the start of a comeback. So next turn, I made a hard read that the opposing Tornadus won't attack, and I predicted it right, and went for a Rain Dance. Kingambit picks up a knockout on Tornadus with Kowtow Cleave, and Amoonguss goes for Pollen Puff, putting Kingambit in a much better position. Raging Bolt stays asleep as my opponent brings out Wellspring Ogerpon. Ogerpon went for Spiky Shield, hoping Raging Bolt would wake up but remains asleep. As Kingambit goes for Kowtow Cleave on the protected Ogerpon, Amoonguss using Pollen Puff again onto my Kingambit, leaving my Kingambit at full health, ready to take and survive an Ivy Cudgel plus Rain from Ogerpon. I decided to go for Rage Powder to redirect Raging Bolt's attack in case it wakes up, but it remains asleep. The Ogerpon goes for an Ivy Cudgel with boosted Rain onto my Kingambit, but Kingambit survives with 30% health remaining. Kingambit used Kowtow Cleave, leaving Ogerpon on Sucker Punch range. My opponent played it safe and used Spiky Shield on Ogerpon, hoping that Raging Bolt will wake up. Kingambit used Sucker Punch on Ogerpon, but it failed. Raging Bolt finally wakes up and used Dragon Pulse onto my Amoonguss, and Kingambit regained some health thanks to the Pollen Puff. So my opponent thought I would go for another Sucker Punch again, but I was confident enough that I could take on another Ivy Cudgel as long as I redirect Raging Bolt's attack. This is where the game stayed starting to go on my favor. My opponent switched out Ogerpon for calyrex Shadow. Raging Bolt goes for Thunderclap onto my Kingambit for chip damage, and Kingambit hits a super effective Kowtow Cleave onto the opposing calyrex, picking up a very crucial knockout. and Amoonguss used Pollen Puff for health regen, making my King Gambit ready to take on the opposing Wellspring Ogerpon. Luckily the rain stopped, but my opponent has not terrestrialized yet. I thought the opposing Ogerpon will go for a spiky shield, but he's finally going all out and used his terrestrialization, boosting Ogerpon's attack. Raging Bolt used Thunderclap for another chip damage, putting my King Gambit's health in range for boosted Ivy Cadril. Ogerpon goes for Ivy Cadril and King Gambit survives with 18 HP remaining health. King Gambit finishes up with Kowtow Cleave onto the opposing Raging Bolt and another Pollen Puff support from Amoonguss, leaving this game state from 2v4 into 2v1. Next turn I can freely redirect Ogerpon's attack since it terrestrialized itself into a water type, and King Gambit can finish it up with Kowtow Cleave, but my opponent knew it's game over, so he surrendered and we proceeded to game 2. This time my opponent leads with Calyrex Shadow and Tornadus, and I also led with my Calyrex Shadow and Tornadus. My opponent wasted no time and decided to Terra defensively with his Calyrex Shadow, but I went for Protect with Calyrex as my Tornadus sets up Tailwind. The opposing Calyrex went for Astral Barrage, leaving my Tornadus at 12 HP. I was ready to say goodbye to my Tornadus as my opponent went for Bleak Wind, but he missed a crucial Bleak Wind. It felt like the luck of accuracy is on my side this time, so I went all out. I terrestrialized my Calyrex Shadow and used Astral Barrage, leaving both of the opposing Pokemons in range for a Bleak Wind, and the crucial Bleak Wind both connect, picking up a double knockout in one turn. My opponent admitted defeat, and that leaves me at 2-0, a very strong start for this tournament. My round 3 opponent is using a Lugia team with Assault Vest Rillaboom, Comfey as their main support, Shukaberry Incineroar, Lugia with Convert Cloak and Multiscale ability, Sableye for screens and interruptions, and finally Annihilate with Safety Goggles. My opponent opened with Lugia and Sableye while I led with Tornadus and Calyrex Shadow. The opposing Lugia used Protect and my Tornadus used Taunt on Lugia to stop the Carmine boost, but Lugia is protected this turn. Sableye used Taunt on my Tornadus and Calyrex gets a free turn of Nasty Plot. I switch my Tornadus out for Amoonguss. My opponent terrestrialized defensively on Lugia while Sableye sets up Light Screen for incoming special attack. I use Astral Barrage with Calyrex, knocking out Sableye and doing 15% damage onto the bulky Lugia. Lugia freely gets a Carmine boost while Comfey comes onto the field. I decided to terrestrialize Amoonguss as I'm predicting Lugia to use super effective Aeroblast onto my Amoonguss. Comfey used Flora Healing, putting Lugia's health back to full as Calyrex used a +2 Astral Barrage, knocking out Comfey this turn. As I predicted it right, Lugia used Aeroblast onto my Amoonguss, doing 50% damage on its health, and Amoonguss lands a crucial Spore onto the opposing Lugia, hoping to put it on sleep for a few turns. Then Annihilate comes in as his last Pokemon. My opponent knew that I was way ahead in this game and we proceeded to game 2. My opponent made an adjustment and led with Annihilate and Sableye this time, and I led with Tornadus and Calyrex again, as my opponent terrestrialized defensively with Annihilate into water, covering its weakness from incoming Astral Barrage and Bleak Wind, while Sableye used Light Screen for defensive boost. Calyrex used Astral Barrage, doing decent amount of damage, hoping to knock out Sableye with Bleak Wind, but Sableye survives, leaving 15% HP remaining on its health. Annihilate used Bulk Up, knowing that it's a free boost up this turn. I went for a Protect with Calyrex and the opposing Annihilate also went for a Protect. Sableye used Taunt onto my protected Calyrex while Tornadus used Bleak Wind, knocking out Sableye this turn. Comfey comes into the field. I switch out Calyrex for Amoonguss while Comfey used Flora Healing, putting Annihilate back to full health. This is where the disaster starts, as Tornadus used Bleak Wind, missing Comfey, but it connected onto the opposing Annihilate, not realizing that Bleak Wind has a 30% of lowering the speed down. Annihilate used Rage Fist onto my Amoonguss, picking up a knockout. Calyrex Shadow comes back onto the field. I went for a Protect with Calyrex while Comfey goes for another Flora Healing. Tornadus used Taunt onto the opposing Comfey to stop the healing, and Annihilate used Rage Fist onto my protected Calyrex. I again switch out Calyrex for King Gambit this time, and the opposing Comfey switch out for Rillaboom. I already know I can't win against a +3 attack Annihilate, so I stalled out to get as much as information as I can and prepare for our game 3, and I surrendered as we proceeded to game 3. This time I made an adjustment on my leads as my opponent opened with the same ones, as I led with Calyrex and Amoonguss this time. I terrestrialized straight away as I was predicting a Rage Fist onto my Calyrex. My opponent also terrestrialized defensively with Annihilate. The opposing Sableye used Taunt onto my Calyrex Shadow as I also predicted that, and used Astral Barrage instead of Nasty Plot. doing enough damage in range for a double knockout next turn. Annihilate used Rage Fist onto my calyrex, leaving its health at 50%. Amoonguss landed the spore onto the opposing Sableye to make it a 2v1 next turn. But my opponent made a smart play to switch out Sableye and bringing in Rillaboom. Annihilate used Protect as calyrex used another Astral Barrage, doing 50% damage onto the opposing Rillaboom. Amoonguss used Pollen Puff, putting calyrex back to full health. I made a misplay by switching out calyrex for Tornadus, instead of switching Amoonguss for Tornadus. The opposing Annihilate used Rage Fist onto my Tornadus, bringing its HP down to 50%, then following a double up with Wood Hammer from Rillaboom, leaving my Tornadus at 4 HP, as Amoonguss used Spore onto the Safety Goggle Annihilate, as I ran out of time when I was supposed to do a side Pollen Puff. I switch out Amoonguss for calyrex, as Tornadus used Taunt onto the opposing Annihilate to cancel out future bulk ups and protects, before Rillaboom uses Grassy Glide to finish off my Tornadus. King Gambit comes to the field. As my opponent switches out Annihilate for Comfy, King Gambit used Sucker Punch but it failed. Calyrex used Astral Barrage hoping to knock out Rillaboom this turn, but it survived with 5% health remaining, as Rillaboom knocks out Calyrex and fainting from the Wood Hammer's recoil. It's pretty much game over for me from here, as I bring in Amoonguss and my opponent brings in Annihilate. Comfy used Draining Kiss onto my King Gambit, putting King Gambit's health in range for close combat from Annihilate. Annihilate picks up a knockout and it's game over. My first loss for this tournament, which puts me on 2-1. My round 4 opponent's team is very scary, as the team consists of Calm Mind, Terra Fairy, Lunala, Mienshao, Rillaboom, Safety Goggles Incineroar, Walking Wake with the item Expert Belt, and Landorus. My opponent led with Landorus and Walking Wake, and I led with Calyrex and Tornadus. I terrestrialized my Calyrex, predicting the opposing Walking Wake will use Snarl, so I went for a nasty plot, leaving Calyrex at +1 after the Snarl. As Walking Wake used Snarl, Landorus used Earth Power, leaving my Calyrex at 42 HP. Tornadus connects both Bleak Wind, doing a decent amount of damage onto the opposing mons. Then I went for Protect with Calyrex, as the opposing Landorus also went for a Protect. Tornadus used Bleak Wind again to set up double knockout for Calyrex next turn, as Walking Wake used Draco Meteor onto my Tornadus, picking up a knockout. Amoonguss comes into the field. The opposing Landorus attempts for double protect, but it failed, as Calyrex used Astral Barrage, picking up a double knockout this turn, and getting a massive boost from the ability Grim Neigh. Amoonguss used Pollen Puff, putting Calyrex health back to 80% HP. My opponent's last Pokemon is Lunala and Mienshao. My opponent decided to terrestrialize defensively with Lunala, planning to reduce the damage from Astral Barrage plus Shadow Shield ability, but I went for Protect with Calyrex for the fake out, but Mienshao targeted Amoonguss instead. The opposing Lunala used Moongeist Beam onto my protected Calyrex. I decided to go for Rage Powder to redirect incoming attacks, as Calyrex used Terra Blast onto the opposing Mienshao, picking up a knockout, putting Calyrex at +4 special attack. Lunala used Moongeist Beam onto my Amoonguss, bringing its health down to 40% remaining. My opponent knew it was game over from here and proceeded to game 2. This time my opponent led with Lunala and Incineroar, as I decided to lead with Calyrex and Amoonguss, predicting that my opponent will open with Lunala this time. I started off with a defensive Terra with Calyrex, but also planning to knock out the opposing Incineroar with Terra Blast. My opponent also terrestrialized Lunala for the incoming Astral Barrage. Incineroar used Fake Out onto my Amoonguss, as Calyrex used Terra Blast onto the Incineroar, picking up a knockout thanks to the Rocky Helmet chip damage, while the opposing Lunala used Moongeist Beam onto my Amoonguss, leaving its HP at 40%. Then my opponent brings in Mienshao. I decided to switch out Amoonguss for Mienshao, as Calyrex used Protect. The opposing Mienshao used Fake Out onto my Mienshao, breaking the sash, and Lunala used Moongeist Beam to finish it off. I bring Amoonguss back in with its HP recovered to 80% thanks to its ability Regenerator. The opposing Mienshao used Wild Guard, as Amoonguss used Rage Powder. Calyrex used Terra Blast onto the opposing Mienshao, leaving its HP at 1. Lunala used Moonblast this time, but only did little damage onto my Amoonguss. Amoonguss used Rage Powder again, as Calyrex picks up a knockout onto the opposing Mienshao with Terra Blast. Lunala used Moongeist Beam, leaving my Amoonguss at 30 HP remaining. My opponent brings in Landorus as his last Pokemon. Landorus used Protect, as Amoonguss used another Rage Powder. Calyrex used Astral Barrage to break Lunala's Shadow Shield ability, leaving its HP at 60%. Lunala used Moonblast, picking up a knockout onto my Amoonguss. King Gambit comes into the field. Calyrex used Astral Barrage to finish things off and picking up a double knockout, and that puts me at 3-1 with 2 more rounds remaining. My opponent's team for round 5 is running another Lunala team, but this time with Shenpao and Dragonite, Rillaboom, Heatran with Magma Storm, plus leftover item, Gastrodon with Rocky Helmet, and Lunala with Power Herb Set and Wide Guard. My opponent leads with Rillaboom and Lunala, as I decided to lead with King Gambit and Amoonguss. My opponent switches out Lunala for Heatran as Rillaboom fakes out my Amoonguss. King Gambit gets a free Kowtow Cleave onto the opposing Heatran, doing 40% damage to its health. I switch out King Gambit to deal with Lunala late game, as I switched in Incineroar. My opponent decided to Terrestrialize Heatran into Grass, and I also Terrestrialized defensively with Amoonguss, expecting a Magma Storm from the opposing Heatran. My opponent switched out Rillaboom for Dragonite, as Heatran used Magma Storm onto my Amoonguss. Amoonguss used Pollen Puff on the Rillaboom slot, which is now a Dragonite, and did barely any damage. Incineroar used Fake Out onto the opposing Heatran, as Dragonite used Low Kick onto the Incineroar, leaving its health at 26 HP. Amoonguss lands a Spore onto the Dragonite, hoping to shut it down for a few turns. The opposing Heatran used Earth Power onto the Incineroar, picking up a knockout as Amoonguss used Pollen Puff, but it failed. Calyrex comes onto the field. My opponent switches out the Sleeping Dragonite and brings in Rillaboom. Heatran used Protect, as Calyrex used Nasty Plot for Big Astro Barrage next turn. Amoonguss used Pollen Puff, assuming Calyrex will take damage this turn, but it failed. Calyrex used Astro Barrage, knocking out the opposing Heatran and leaving Rillaboom at 10% HP. Rillaboom used Wood Hammer, leaving Calyrex at 46 HP as Rillaboom fainted from Wood Hammer's recoil. Amoonguss used Pollen Puff, recovering Calyrex health to 80% full, as my opponent brings out his final two Pokemon, Lunala and the Sleeping Dragonite. I decided to Terra Blast with Calyrex onto the opposing Dragonite, and Lunala used Moonguy Spin, finishing my Calyrex. Amoonguss used Spore, putting Lunala to sleep, and allowing King Gambit to be in a much better position. Amoonguss redirects incoming attack with Rage Powder, as the Dragonite finally woke up and used Low Kick onto my Amoonguss, taking Rocky Helmet damage, leaving Dragonite's health at 5 HP. King Gambit used Kowtow Cleave onto the opposing Lunala. I used Rage Powder again with Amoonguss as Dragonite used Low Kick, fainting from the Rocky Helmet damage and leaving Amoonguss at 4 HP. King Gambit used Kowtow Cleave to finish up the game as Lunala remains asleep, and that puts me to 4-1 in this tournament, with one more round remaining before the top cut. For my final Swiss round, I've been paired against a Zamazenta team with Choice Scarf, Rapid Strike Urshifu, Incineroar, Assault Vest Raging Bolt, Amoonguss, and Iron Jugulis. So game 2, my opponent led with Amoonguss and Incineroar, as I decided to lead with Calyrex and Tornadus. I made a read that Incineroar will use Knockoff, so I Terrestrialized defensively with Calyrex. Amoonguss used Protect as Tornadus attempts to use Taunt onto the protected Amoonguss. Calyrex used Nasty Plot as Incineroar used Parting Shot to switch in Zamazenta. The opposing Amoonguss used Rage Powder as I finally used Taunt with Tornadus, shutting down Amoonguss for next turn. I went for another Nasty Plot again, as Zamazenta used Body Press, leaving my Calyrex at 17 HP remaining. I finally went for Astro Barrage with Calyrex, picking up a knockout on the opposing Amoonguss and leaving Zamazenta at 1 HP, as Tornadus connects with a Bleakwind onto the opposing Zamazenta, picking up a knockout and leaving us with his final two Pokemon, Raging Bolt and Incineroar. As I protected with Calyrex, Incineroar used Fake Out onto my protected Calyrex. Tornadus connect both Bleakwind and Raging Bolt use Electro Web, leaving my Tornadus at 40% HP remaining. I switch out Calyrex for King Gambit, as Raging Bolt attempts to Thunderclap my Calyrex. Tornadus use another Bleakwind, missing the attack on Raging Bolt. Incineroar used Knockoff, finishing up my Tornadus as Calyrex comes back. I decided to make a hard read that my opponent will Terrestrialize Incineroar, so I used Kowtow Cleave onto the opposing Incineroar. Calyrex used Protect as Raging Bolt tries to Thunderclap again. King Gambit used Kowtow Cleave onto the Terra Ghost Incineroar, picking up a knockout, and my opponent is down to his last Pokemon. I switch out my Calyrex for Amoonguss as Raging Bolt used Electro Web, activating King Gambit's Defiant ability. King Gambit used Kowtow Cleave, leaving Raging Bolt's health at 5% remaining. As the game state is 3v1, my opponent admitted defeat, and that leaves me at 5-1 in Swiss rounds, which guarantees me to top cut. My first opponent in top cut is running a Calyrex Shadow team with Amoonguss, Incineroar, Tornadus, Komuro with Leftovers, Mystic Water, Rapid Strike Urshifu, and Calyrex Shadow with Focus Sash. My opponent led with Amoonguss and Urshifu, and I led with Tornadus and King Gambit. My opponent outplayed me, making me think Amoonguss will go for a Spore as I used Taunt, keeping me away from using Bleakwind as he switches out for Tornadus. So my Tornadus ended up using Taunt on the opposing Tornadus, as Urshifu used Surging Strikes onto my Tornadus, leaving its HP at 1, as King Gambit used Kowtow Cleave onto the opposing Urshifu, doing very little damage. My opponent switched out Tornadus to bring back the Amoonguss, as I decided to Terrestrialize my King Gambit, overreading my opponent would use Close Combat with Urshifu. My Tornadus sets up Tailwind, as the opposing Urshifu finishes my Tornadus with Aqua Jet. King Gambit used Low Kick, bringing down Urshifu into Astro Barrage range as Calyrex comes to the field. Urshifu used Aqua Jet onto my King King Gambit for chip damage, as Calyrex used Astro Barrage knocking out Urshifu, and leaving Amoonguss in range for King Gambit to finish it off with Iron Head. But I was wrong, leaving Amoonguss at around 5 HP. Amoonguss used Spore onto my Calyrex, which puts me on a really bad position as the opposing Calyrex comes in. I decided to switch out Calyrex for Mienshao, as my opponent decided to go offensive by terrestrializing Calyrex. The opposing Calyrex used Astro Barrage knocking out my King Gambit and putting Mienshao at 1 HP. My sleeping Calyrex comes back, as I'm down to my last Pokemon. My opponent switch out Amoonguss for Tornadus as Mienshao used Wide Guard. My Calyrex stays asleep, as the opposing Calyrex used Psychic, knocking out my Mienshao and leaving me at 1v3, so I wasted no time and proceeded to game 2. My opponent led with the same mons as I made an adjustment and led with Calyrex and Tornadus. I taunted the opposing Amoonguss with Tornadus as Calyrex used Astro Barrage and miscalculating the damage on Urshifu, thinking that I would pick up a knockout. Urshifu used Surging Strikes onto my Calyrex, leaving its HP at 4, as Amoonguss tries to go for a Spore but it's been taunted. I switch my Calyrex out for Amoonguss, hoping that Urshifu would Aqua Jet and faints from the Rocky Helmet damage. My opponent switches out his Amoonguss for Tornadus. Urshifu used Aqua Jet onto my Rocky Helmet Amoonguss and fainted, as Tornadus used Bleak Wind, leaving the opposing Tornadus at 50 HP remaining. The opposing Calyrex comes in. I decided to switch out Amoonguss for King Gambit to put pressure onto the opposing Calyrex, but my opponent decided to terrestrialize Calyrex for a big Astro Barrage. The opposing Calyrex used Astro Barrage, doing 20% damage onto my King Gambit and leaving my Tornadus at 2 HP. My Tornadus used Bleak Wind, missing a crucial attack onto the opposing Tornadus, and the opposing Tornadus connects both Bleak Wind, knocking out my Tornadus. My opponent played it safe and used Protect onto his Calyrex, as the opposing Tornadus used Tailwind to secure the game next turn. King Gambit used Sucker Punch onto the protected Calyrex as my Calyrex used Astro Barrage, picking up a knockout onto the opposing Tornadus. The opposing Amoonguss comes back to the field. The game state is not going on my favor, as I misplayed too many times, but I kept playing hoping that my opponent wouldn't go Rage Powder, redirecting my King Gambit's Kowtow Cleave away from the opposing Calyrex. So I protected with my Calyrex as the opposing Amoonguss used Rage Powder. The opposing Calyrex used Astro Barrage, leaving my King Gambit at 40% health remaining, as King Gambit used Kowtow Cleave onto the opposing Amoonguss. I switch out Calyrex for Amoonguss to stall Tailwind as the opposing Amoonguss used Rage Powder again. The opposing Calyrex used Astro Barrage, leaving King Gambit's health at 8 HP and doing 60% damage onto my Amoonguss. King Gambit used Kowtow Cleave onto the opposing Amoonguss, picking up a knockout, but King Gambit faints from the Rocky Helmet damage, leaving this game at 2v1 with one more turn of Tailwind. I decided to terrestrialize Amoonguss, hoping that it would survive an Astro Barrage, as I protected my Calyrex. The opposing Calyrex used Astro Barrage, knocking out Amoonguss, leaving the game state at 1v1, with no more turns of Tailwind for my opponent, which leaves both Calyrex at speed tie. So both Calyrex are max speed timid, and the opposing Calyrex have taken damage, which makes the Focus Sash now useless. The time has come. Whoever goes first wins the game. We've both locked in our moves, and the opposing Calyrex wins the speed tie, eliminating me from top cut as my journey ends. Overall, I'm pretty happy with my result, despite only having a few days of practice. I've definitely learnt a lot from this tournament, and I played against a lot of good players. If you liked this video, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. Until next time, see ya!